different ways. First, he's going to ask it in a more comfortable way. Who do people say that I am? Like, that's the way that we love. Well, this is just what they say. Like, not what I say, this is just what they say. It's the more comfortable way. But then he's going to get to the crucial question. Who do you say that I am? Now, at the front of it, like if you are not familiar with this passage, you might think, that's kind of a weird question. I mean, just for a moment, step back and think about the question, who am I, or who are you? That's not a question we ask very often, even if people we don't know. Most of the time, if you meet someone you don't know, you're going to ask, what do you do? Where are you from? They're here at church this morning, you might say, how did you get here? How'd you hear about us? But think about it, if you are new here, or relatively new, and on your way out, you shake my hand, and I go, who are you? Like, you're going to be like a little bit like, probably going to respond, well, who are you? Right? It's a weird question, but Jesus doesn't ask, who are you? He asks something even more weird. He asks, who am I? And he doesn't ask it to people who don't know him. He asks it to people who have walked with him for over a year, daily. Can you imagine if you're a member of this church, if we know each other pretty well, and on the way out, I shake your hand and I go, who am I? You're going to think a whole host of things about me. And you're going to wonder how to answer that question. You're Jeff? Maybe my friend, I hope. My pastor, you're Carson and Knox's dad. I mean, there's a whole sense of ways that you might answer that question, but you'd probably be a little bit taken aback. Why does Jesus ask such a weird question? I think it's because he's different. In fact, he's altogether different. He is unique. See, understanding who Jesus is fundamental to understanding all sorts of things. It's fundamental to understanding who we are. It's fundamental to understanding who God is. It's fundamental to understanding what this world and life is all about. And it is fundamental, especially in light of our text this morning, to understanding what it means to follow him. See, this question, who is Jesus, is fundamental not only in the Gospel of Mark, it's fundamental to our entire life. It is the distinguishing question of the Christian faith. Now, here's what I think might be the problem this morning, is I think most of us assume we know the answer. Like, you might be sitting here right now and just think, I've got this down pat. Like, we're good to get. I know who Jesus is. But I was reminded this week of the Jesus Seminar. You may not be familiar with the Jesus Seminar. It occurred primarily in kind of the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And it was a group of scholars, historical scholars, who sat down, and their kind of goal was to find the real historical Jesus. They were looking for the Jesus of history. And that was in sort of contra to the biblical Jesus that they referred to as the Jesus of faith. And so what these scholars did is they sort of literally sat down and they went through all the things that Jesus did, all the events in the Gospels. And they had these different colored beads, and they will say, yeah, I think this probably really did happen, or I don't think this actually happened. And then go through all the sayings of Jesus, everything that the gospel writers say that Jesus uttered. And they would have different beads that would say, yeah, I think he probably said this. No, he probably didn't say this. He might have said this. Now, you probably wouldn't be too surprised that at the end of this endeavor, they ended up with a Jesus that looked a lot like them. They ended up making a Jesus in their own image, a Jesus of their own reflection. They made Jesus into who they wanted him to be. Now, you'd be right to scoff at the pride and hubris of such an endeavor. But I also think we need to be warned by it. See, we're actually tempted to do something pretty similar, I think, often. Deep down, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we would find that in our sin and self-centeredness, we often want to define who Jesus is too. We want to shape Jesus according to our desires and wants. We want to focus on those passages and characteristics of Jesus that we particularly like, and we want to ignore or neglect those passages and characteristics of Jesus that are maybe a little bit more difficult for us. We want a Jesus that we can make requests of. but not a Jesus that makes requests of us. We want a Jesus who has the power to deliver to us the good life, but not a Jesus who has the authority to define the good life for us, to tell us what life must be. See, we want often a benign or comfortable Jesus. See, sometimes we can end up, even ourselves, with a Jesus who follows us, not a Jesus we must follow. See, our passage this morning is a wake-up call. And it's a wake-up call that I think we need to hear repeatedly. See, in our passage, we are going to be reminded that it is not us who define Jesus, but it's actually Jesus who defines us. Our main idea from the passage this morning is this: Jesus can demand anything of us as the King who gave everything for us. Jesus can demand anything of us as the King who gave everything for us. Let's look at the passage, verses 27 through 38. Here's what it says. Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he strictly warned them to tell no one about him. Then he began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, to be killed and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns." Calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? And what can anyone give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." 3 points we're going to see from this passage this morning: the purpose, the person of Jesus, the purpose of Jesus, and the path of following Jesus. The person, the purpose, and the path. Let's look first at the person of Jesus. The question that I referred to being at the center of this passage, Jesus asks it while he and his disciples are journeying along the road. They've just left Bethsaida, which, if you remember a couple weeks ago, is where Jesus healed the blind man. And now they are moving north, about 25 miles north, up to Caesarea Philippi. And as they're on the road, Jesus asks this question. Remember, this is the one that's a little bit easier. Who do people say that I am? And the disciples essentially recount what we've already read in Mark. Most of the people, most of the crowds believe that Jesus is one of the prophets. Maybe even John the Baptist returned, or the second coming, in the sense, of Elijah. Now, remember, John the Baptist, the reason for that, primarily we saw in chapter 6, how Herod really wondered if Jesus was the return or a coming again of John. And that was particularly concerning for Herod, King Herod, because he's the one who had wrongly put John the Baptist to death. So some people thought, well, maybe this is John. Others thought that he was Elijah. And you might wonder, well, why Elijah? Among all the other prophets, why Elijah? Well, if you remember, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, Elijah had a little bit of a different departure from this world in life. Elijah would continue to kind of be a curiosity, in a sense, for Jews, all like ages and generations after Elijah. See, in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, speaking of Elijah and Elisha here, here's what Scripture says. As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the two of them. Then Elijah went up into heaven in the whirlwind. See, there'd be a reason why people wondered about Elijah. You add this to the fact that there are prophecies in the Old Testament that Elijah would return and be the forerunner to tell of the coming of the Messiah. So you understand why some people might have thought that Jesus was Elijah. But even if they didn't think Elijah or John the Baptist, they thought that he was one of the prophets. Now, you need to understand this. This is significant, right? I mean, the prophets were ridiculed in their day, but by the time of Jesus' day, they are in a place of high honor. They're the very messengers of God. So when people are saying Jesus is one of the prophets, they're making a significant claim. I mean, they're saying something that's really important, really weighty. Everybody recognizes that there's something about Jesus. And yet, in light of everything that we've seen so far, everything that Jesus has done and everything that Jesus has taught in these first 8 chapters of Mark, to simply say that Jesus is one of the prophets, in fact, to say that he is anything like anything that has come before, to put him in a line of anything else, is to actually miss Jesus. And not just to miss him in part, it is to miss him entirely. See, that's why I believe that Jesus then turns to his disciples, those who should know him best. And look at verse 29. He says the really critical question, who do you say I am? If you know the Gospels, you won't be surprised that Peter is the first one to speak up. Peter answers, but he doesn't answer just alone. He's answering on behalf of the disciples. And Peter gets the answer right. He says, you are the Messiah. Now, some of your translations might have Christ there. Christ is the Greek word. Messiah is the Hebrew word. They're the same things. They're meaning the same thing. Peter says, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ. Now, readers of Mark's gospel shouldn't be surprised. This is exactly how Mark began his gospel. You remember Mark chapter 1, verse 1? This is the very beginning. The beginning of the gospel or good news of Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. But we haven't heard the term Christ or Messiah used again until this moment, 8 chapters later. And Peter is the first human being to rightly identify who Jesus is. But what does it mean that Jesus is the Messiah? What does it mean that he is the Christ? Well, that word literally means anointed one. And it comes out of the Old Testament. Those who were anointed in the Old Testament, there were people in certain times and in certain situations who were anointed, usually prophets, priests, and kings. Those are the 3 primary sort of leadership offices of the Old Testament. But when Peter says that Jesus is the anointed one, he's not saying he's just another anointed one. He's not saying simply what the crowd said, that Jesus is just another prophet or another priest or another king. No, Peter's really clear here. He's saying Jesus is the anointed one. See, throughout the Old Testament, there was this promise, this prophecy that there would be a truly anointed one who would come, who would be the chief prophet, who would be the great high priest, who would be the eternal king. And Peter is saying, Jesus, you are that promised one. You are the king who will come from the line of David and who will take the throne of Israel and will establish God's kingdom forevermore. Who is Jesus? Well, the disciples' answer is this. He's the one that they had been waiting for. In fact, he's the one that all the people of God had been waiting for. To use the words of Mr. Beaver from the Chronicles of Narnia, he's the king, I tell you. That's who Jesus is. That's what it means when Peter and the disciples confess that he is the Messiah. Now, there's so much more that will be said and could be said, but I think it's helpful, even right now, to just pause and reflect on this for a moment. See, Jesus is not just another of some sort. He's not another leader. He's not another teacher. He's not another guide. He is altogether different. He is altogether greater. Church, I think one of the dangers for us is that we are so tempted, and I think can easily fall into, to ignoring or neglecting the utter magnitude of who Jesus is. See, I wonder, I think for many of us, if maybe Jesus has become common to us. Maybe even you read through a passage, maybe even right now you're hearing Peter's confession and you're sort of like, okay, yeah, sure. Maybe you see this even in your Christian life. You pray and you're sometimes absent-minded when you think at the end, in Jesus' name. Maybe that's just something you say is almost like a punctuation mark at the end of your prayer, but you don't really consider, what does it mean when we pray in Jesus' name? Who is Jesus? I think for many of us, we could be in danger of seeing some sort of celebrity, athlete, an actor, a musician, be amazed. Oh, did you see him? Do you know who I saw today? He could take our breath away. And you know, we can open our Bibles. We can pray. We can even this morning gather together as God's people where Jesus promises us that he is in our midst. And we can yawn. So we're thinking, yeah. I wonder, the question for us is, has familiarity with Jesus brought about formality to Jesus? Has our familiarity with Jesus brought about a formality to Jesus? See, I think it's so important that we remember the glory of who Jesus is. And I think few passages help us to do so better than Revelation chapter 1. If you're not familiar with Revelation chapter 1, it's written by the Apostle John, the beloved disciple who walked with Jesus, and he gets a sight of Jesus right now in his glory in heaven. And here's what he says. It says this, verses 12 through 18. Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. When I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was one like the Son of Man. Remember, that's exactly who Jesus refers to himself as in this passage. Now, this language is going to be very symbolic, but it's so powerful. Dressed in a robe with a golden sash wrapped around his chest, he is the king. The hair of his head was white as wool, white as snow, and his eyes like a fiery flame. His feet were like fine bronze as it is fired in a furnace, and his voice like the sound of cascading waters, like a waterfall. He had 7 stars in his right hand. A sharp, double-edged sword came from his mouth, and his face was shining like the sun at full strength. If you've ever walked outside in the brightness of full day, that's how Jesus' face was. Look at John's reaction. When I saw him, the beloved disciple, the one who walked with Jesus, I fell at his feet like a dead man. And he laid his right hand on me and said, "Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one." Here's the glory of Jesus. Here's how we would see him if we were to see him in his glory right now. See, Jesus is not just another in a long line of others. No, Peter is right. Jesus is the Christ. He's the Messiah, the anointed one. He is the eternal King. See, Jesus can demand anything of us. Why? Because he's the King. But you know what's so wonderful about Jesus? That would bring our obedience. It ought to recognize who he is, but maybe not our worship. But see, Jesus isn't just the King. He's the King who gave everything for us. So we saw his person. Let's look now at the purpose of Jesus. The person of Jesus leads us into the purpose of Jesus. Look at verses 31 and 32 of Mark chapter 8. We're just going to look at the first half of 32. Here's what it says. Then he, Jesus, began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this. Right after Peter's confession, his right confession of who Jesus is, Jesus transitions in his teaching. Do you see how Mark describes it? Look at what Mark said again there right in verse 31. He began to teach them. Has Jesus not been teaching them his entire ministry? Why does Mark say he began to teach them? Because this is something new. See, Jesus is now going to go to a different sort of teaching. He's going to teach his disciples what it means that he is the Messiah and how it is that he is going to save God's people. And this sort of teaching is not going to be there's no more parables anymore. There's no more sort of veiled meetings. Look at verse 32. He spoke openly about this. That word openly means plainly. It means boldly. It means you can't miss it. Jesus is just as clear as he possibly can be in what he says here. There's no confusing it. But that doesn't mean that Jesus' teaching here isn't surprising. In fact, I would argue that it's shocking. Look at what Jesus says. He says that he is the Son of Man who will suffer many things, be rejected by the leadership of Israel, and be killed, and then after 3 days, raise from the dead. Friends, it's so important to note, no one expected the Messiah to suffer, let alone die. So when Jesus says this, it is shocking. I mean, look at what he says in verse 31. He began to teach them that it was necessary, that he must suffer. No one expected that. All of the Jews, and I think the disciples, and certainly Peter's reaction confirms this, all of them thought that the Messiah would raise to power, that the Messiah would take the throne of Israel, that the Messiah would defeat the enemies of Israel, mainly Rome, and that the Messiah would then establish holiness and peace in Israel forevermore. He was to be the great and wonderful king. But what does Jesus say? No. The Son of Man must. It was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things, to be rejected, and to die. Now, this is what this means. When we see that Jesus says it was necessary, that he must suffer, that means that his death was not an accident. There'll be people who will say this. You've probably heard this. If you watch some national kind of news or something like that, they will say, well, Jesus was this revolutionary whose revolution led to his death. But the scriptures tell us that his death was the revolution. Jesus was not like some brave soldier who was running into the battle and sort of saying, come what may. It's not that Jesus might die. Now, what does Mark say? He must die. See, Jesus' death was the point. Jesus, in fact, tells us this in John 10:10. He says, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down on my own. Jesus came to die. This is not an accident. This is what he came to do. And the question for us is why? Why was it necessary that the Messiah suffer, be rejected, and die? Well, I think simply put, it's because of our sin. See, I think sometimes we can forget this. Our sin against God comes at a great cost. See, when we have sinned because of our rebellion against God, we have been alienated from God, our Creator, who we were made for. And our sin has brought us death. The cost of our sin must be paid for. See, we can forget this about forgiveness. All forgiveness always comes at a cost. I think sometimes it can be easier to conceive of it financially. So if you imagine that I'm pulling out of your driveway today and I just absolutely drill your mailbox, like I run it over, you have two options. One, I can pay and get you a new mailbox. Or you can forgive the cost. You can forgive my running over your mailbox. But then what happens? Who has to pay the cost of the mailbox? You do. You absorb the cost. Now, it makes more sense maybe financially, but it's true for sin and wrongdoing. If someone gossips about you, if they hurt your reputation and maybe even elevate theirs, you again have one of two options. You can make them pay. You can try to get revenge. You can try to bring restitution. You can put down their reputation and try to elevate yours, or you can forgive them. But when you forgive them, who absorbs the cost? Who suffers for their wrongdoing of gossip? You do. All forgiveness requires some sort of suffering and absorbing of the cost. There is always a cost for forgiveness. And when forgiveness happens, the one who pays the cost, who absorbs it, is the one who has been sinned against. Now, what does this have to do with Jesus having to die? Well, we, the Bible tells us, have sinned against God. And when you sin against an infinite God, a perfect, loving creator, the glorious God of the universe, that sin actually brings about an infinite cost. It's a cost that you and I, no human being, can ever pay for on their own. We would never be able to pay the cost. But it must be paid. Remember, friends, in order for God to be just and good, he must punish sin. He would not be good if he were to not uphold what is good. And so in order for him to forgive us, that cost has to be paid for. So again, there's two options. Either we pay the cost of our sin, and the Bible tells us that that is eternal judgment. It's hell. Or God must actually absorb the cost of our sin. That's why Jesus came. That's why it was necessary for Jesus to suffer, to be rejected, and to die. Because Jesus actually came to take on the very penalty for our sin, to die the death that we deserve to die, to absorb the wrath, the right wrath of God for our sin and rebellion. Christ came to take that suffering upon himself so that we might be forgiven. See, here's what Jesus has done. Here's why Jesus must die. But we need to be clear, we not only see the depths of our sin and the cost of our sin when we see Jesus' suffering. We also see the depths of his grace and the depths of his love. Church, don't miss this. We see this throughout the Old Testament, how great this substitutionary work of Christ is. Think about Isaiah 53, verses 5 and 6. I just want us to have this in mind, how the entire Old Testament tells us that this is how forgiveness works. Verses 5 and 6, but he was pierced because of our rebellion, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We all have turned to our own way, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. See, here's what Jesus is telling us, that he came in order to suffer, even at this point in his ministry, which means he chose. He willingly suffers, even death, for us. Now, that is a whole different sort of love. I mean, honestly, it is a love that is counter to our culture's understanding of love. I would argue that it's even counter to how we most often love. Tim Keller says, well, that often our love is transactional. And what he means by that is that our love is often conditional. We give it only as long as the person is affirming us and meeting our needs. We will love someone as long as they love us. We love in order to receive from someone else. But our love, Keller says, also can be protective. We hold back so that we can cut our losses if necessary. Man, that just grabbed me this week. How often we sort of hold back some of our love. We won't give ourselves to another because we don't want to get hurt. We want to cut our losses. We want to protect ourselves. But you see how different Jesus' love is? Jesus needs nothing and gains nothing from loving us. He just loves us. And he doesn't hold anything back. He doesn't protect us at all. He gives everything, even his very life for us. See, this is true love and true grace, a love and a grace that actually transforms us. Do you see that Jesus can demand anything of us as the king who gave everything for us? As the king, he has the authority to demand anything of us. But as the king who gave everything for us, not only is it to obey our king to give whatever he demands, but it's also worship. We ought to be eager and wanting to do so. So we've seen the person, we've seen the purpose. Now let's look at the path of following Jesus. Now, what we see here is that following Jesus actually resembles, in part, Jesus' path. I think this is why Peter has the reaction that he does. Look at verse 32. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Now, that word for rebuke is the same word used of Jesus, when Jesus rebukes the demons. Peter's not just playing around here. This is a strong, serious scolding that he has given to Jesus. See, this means Peter isn't just surprised by Jesus' statement. He's not even just worried about Jesus' statement. No, he's offended by it. Now, why is he so offended? What's going on in Peter's heart and mind? Well, I think Jesus tells us in verse 33, the second half. Look at what Jesus says. He says, "You are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns." See, Jesus says, Peter, there's really two senses to this. Peter, you are thinking about worldly things. Your concerns are this world. You're concerned with success and security and significance. But not just that, Peter. You're concerned with yourself. So you have to imagine, the disciples were probably feeling this way too. I mean, if Jesus was going to take the throne of Israel, if he was going to be this great and promised king, this glorious king, what would that mean for his closest followers? What would that mean for someone like Peter, who intends to be Jesus' right-hand man? It would mean a lot of glory for Peter as well. See, Jesus knows that Peter is concerned with himself and worldly things, not with God's glory. That's why Jesus refers to Peter sort of shockingly to us as Satan, because Peter's thinking is satanic. I mean, honestly, this sort of rebuke of Peter looks almost exactly like Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. See, he's saying, no, Jesus, grab all of the significance, but not the suffering. Get all the glory, but don't worry about God's plan. Don't worry about God's will. That's the same temptation that Satan was tempting Jesus in the wilderness. Now Peter is rebuking Jesus with those same sort of thoughts. See, I told you a couple weeks ago, this is why Jesus heals the blind man in 2 stages. At least I think that's what's happening. Because what we see here is almost like an enacted parable. If you remember a couple weeks ago, Jesus first touched the man's eyes and he sort of saw. Jesus asked him, "Do you see?" And he said, "Well, I think I see people, but they're sort of blurry." And then he touches the man's eyes again and he sees everything clearly. Well, now what we see coming right out of that is Peter and the disciples, they sort of see. They rightly confess who Jesus is. He's the Messiah. And yet, in some way, it's blurry. It's foggy, it's vague. Their vision of Jesus is blurred by their own sin and selfish desires. They don't see clearly yet. Now, in light of the disciples and Peter's response, Jesus digs in. This is how we know what was going on in Peter's heart. Look at verse 34. This is so important for us to understand what it means to follow Jesus. Calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Now, this shouldn't be surprising to us at this point. We've already been told that Jesus is the King, that we are to follow him. And we've been told that he is the King who will suffer many things, die or be rejected and die. So it would make sense that to follow Jesus means to deny ourselves and to take up the cross. But I want us to think just a moment on what those two things mean. What does it mean to deny ourselves? I think most simply it means that we're not king. If Jesus is the King, then that means we are not. To follow Jesus then as the King means, as one commentator says, it means to renounce your claim to yourself, your desires, your ambitions, your personal goals, and to submit to Christ. See, here's what it means to deny ourselves. Church, it means that we are not our own anymore. Our lives are no longer about us. They're about Christ. See, this is why in the beginning it's so dangerous that we try to make a Jesus who follows us instead of a Jesus we must follow. This is why it's so dangerous when we flip this around and we sort of make Jesus out to be a means by which we get our desires, our ambitions, our goals. It's actually the exactly opposite of what it means to follow Jesus. To follow Christ is to be willing to give our whole lives, our very hearts, our everything to Jesus. It's to live utterly open-handed before our King. It's to say to Jesus in a very real way, everything I am and everything I have is yours. That's what it means to deny ourselves. But Jesus doesn't just say deny ourselves. He also says take up the cross. And what he means by that is not to don a necklace or to wear a t-shirt that has a cross on it, to get a certain tattoo or something like that. We have to remember what the cross was in Jesus' day. The cross in Jesus' day was the worst instrument of humiliation and suffering imaginable. I mean, it was the absolute worst way to die in the ancient world. And so what is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying to follow me might mean that you will endure immense shame and suffering. That the call might even be to that. It certainly was for those who were hearing Jesus when he said this. The disciples, the apostles, they will all die for proclaiming Jesus. And they will die in really difficult, hard ways. Many of them will be crucified. Peter himself will be crucified, church history tells us, upside down. But you know what? It also was true for the first readers or hearers of Mark's gospel. These readers or hearers, remember, they are Christians in Rome. That's who Mark's writing to. And they are in Rome in the time probably of Emperor Nero, which means that many of these Christians that were hearing this message right here first read, they would be humiliatingly, mockingly murdered and crucified by Nero because Nero will blame them for lighting Rome on fire when actually he did it. They will endure the same thing. They will suffer because of Christ and the gospel. Now, see, this, I think, for us sometimes can feel discouraging. Man, to deny ourselves and to take up the cross and follow Jesus, that feels discouraging. But can you imagine how encouraging it would have been to the early church? Because as they faced imminent suffering and death, they would know that's not a sign that God has abandoned them. Suffering is not a sign that God has abandoned us. No, to suffer for Jesus and for the gospel is actually to participate in the suffering of Jesus. It's actually a symbol or a sign of following Christ. Now, I want to be really clear on what this means. Just get practical. What is it that who Jesus is and what he's done means for us? Again, I think a pastor summarizes it well when he talks about a conversation he had with a member. Here's how he talks about it. He says this: I asked her what was so scary about unmerited free grace. She replied something like this: if I was saved by my good works, then there would be a limit to what God could ask of me or put me through. I would be like a taxpayer with rights. I would have done my duty, and now I would deserve a certain quality of life. I don't think any of us believe that, but I think sometimes we're tempted to live like that. But here's what she continues to say. But if it is really true that I am a sinner saved by sheer grace at Christ's infinite cost, then there's nothing he cannot ask of me. Here's what Jesus is saying as the King who's given everything for us, is that to follow him means that there is nothing he cannot ask of us. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean that Jesus is calling us to a bad life. I think you could hear that this morning and be wrong. He's not calling us to deny for the sake of denying. He's not calling us to suffer for the sake of suffering. Now, look at what he goes on to say. Look at verse 35. This is so important. He's actually calling us to life, to joy, to hope, true, eternal life. Here's what he says: for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. He uses a play on words here. He's saying anybody who lives to preserve this physical life on earth will ultimately lose their soul. But those who actually are willing to lose even their physical life, to give up, in one sense, this world, their life and livelihood, will actually gain their soul. They'll gain true, everlasting life in Christ. See, here's the showstopper, verse 36. For what does it benefit for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? If we get every single thing the world has to offer, if we get all the riches and renown imaginable, but not Christ, what have we gained? What benefit is that? It's nothing. See, here's what Jesus is reminding us: to have everything we've ever wanted and not Christ is to have nothing. But to have nothing that this world offers and have Christ is to have more than we could have ever wanted. That's what Jesus is telling us. He's telling us that this is true life. You know, I tried to illustrate this past week for our kids. I had the privilege of teaching at the kids' Christmas party, and I think my illustration ended up being greater than the message in that case, but I brought a book bag, and I just packed it full with the heaviest books I can find. And in fact, I actually even put some hand weights in there. Like, I just made that thing heavy. And I began the illustration, and I asked the kindergarten through fifth grade, who thinks they can lift this bag and put it on their shoulders? So kids, everybody wanted to lift this bag. And they tried to put it on their shoulders. And some of them could lift it. Some of them couldn't lift it at all. Like, they just fell backwards when they tried to put it on. They couldn't get it up off the ground. A few, especially older kids, could actually get it up. And some could even put it on their shoulders. And they kind of walked around like this in the room. And I said, yeah, okay, you can lift it. But imagine if you had to carry that for the entire Christmas party. And they're like, oh. It's like it would ruin the party, wouldn't it? See, here's what Jesus is reminding us, what the Bible so often reminds us, is that when we make life, when we live, when we put our hope, our joy, our identity, our security in the things of this world, in people and in stuff, one of two things will happen. Either it will crush us or we will crush it. It's like that heavy bag. One of two things will happen. Either it will crush us Our job will lose it. We'll have relationships that are broken and hurt and strained. It will rain on our vacation. Something will go wrong, and it will not be able to uphold us. And what happens when we have put so much into things that cannot hold? Well, it will destroy us. I mean, it will hurt deeply. Or the other option, either it will crush us or we will crush those things. If we put all of our hope and joy and identity and even good things like family or friendship or work or success or significance, popularity, even things like vacation or leisure, if we put all of it on those things, they will ultimately crush over that, trying to carry that burden. We'll actually make those things miserable. We see this all the time. Find someone who has put everything into their work, that's who they are. And I bet you will find a person who does not enjoy work. Work is only a burden. Find an athlete who made everything being this level of athletics. And you will find somebody who will no longer enjoy their sport, but probably hate it. Find somebody, Scrooge in the Christmas Carol is like the perfect example of this. Somebody who really, their goal is to get as much riches and money as they can. That's the very thing that makes them most miserable. See, to actually try to find our life in the things of this world on our own is actually the way to lose our life. You won't be surprised. C.S. Lewis says it much better than I do. Here's what he says. Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, the death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and the death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being and you will find eternal life. Keep nothing back. Nothing that you have not given away will really be yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him. And with him, everything else thrown in. Jesus is not calling us to the bad life. Jesus does not demand of us what is bad for us. He's calling us to true life. The only life that is really true and lasting that is found in him. He is calling us to death to self, but to life in him. Now, lastly, friends, I need you to see that this means is not just a suggestion of Jesus. Look at verse 38. There's a gravity to this verse. Jesus finishes by saying, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Jesus says, if you deny me, I will deny you. If you're ashamed of me, then in that coming judgment, I will be ashamed of you. D.A. Carson once said it this way: the New Testament does not offer a lot of encouragement for people who want just enough of Christ to be saved. See, what Jesus is making very clear is you can't just have him as Savior, but not Lord and King. To have him as Savior means that he is Lord and King. See, we can't sort of have one foot in with Jesus and one foot where we are in charge and in with the world. To do so is actually to have 2 feet out. Jesus demands our whole selves as the King who gave everything for us. See, Jesus is the King. And to follow him means to receive him as our King. It means to submit our whole selves and lives to him. I just want us to think practically at the end. I want you to wonder, is there an area, or when you think about your life, yourself, is it fundamentally yours or Jesus's? When you think about your family, think about your friendships, your relationships, when you think about your work, when you think about your dreams, when you think about your plans, when you think about your downtime, when you think about your health, is it fundamentally yours or Jesus's? Is there an area in your life that you haven't submitted to him? See, I wonder if there's something that he's asking of you that you simply won't give. Is there a sin that you just won't confess? Is there a conversation about Jesus with someone that you're just unwilling to have? Is there a plan for your life that you won't let go of? Is there a person in your life that you won't forgive? Is there a situation in which you are in which you won't trust him? Maybe even is there a spiritual discipline to which you simply won't commit? See, here's what it means. Here's what Jesus is saying, that he is the king, and he is the king who has come to save us. And he has done so by giving everything, his very life for us. And what does that mean for us? It means to follow him is to be willing to give anything that he asks. It's to be open-handed before him. But church, that is the only way of true joy and true life. Jesus can demand anything of us as the king who gave everything for us. Let's pray.